Hi everyone, welcome to episode 5 of Learn to Play Shogi. This is the last episode in the Learn to Play Shogi series. In episodes 1 through 4, I showed you what all the pieces are, how to recognize them, how they move, and the rules of the game. And so the purpose of episode 5 here is to give you some idea of how to play the game, and then from there on you're on your own. If you find yourself at any time during this video not having trouble recognizing the pieces or remembering how they move, feel free to go back and review the first 4 videos, because they will give you a solid grounding in that, and it may take more than one viewing for it to really sink in. Another way is just to practice playing the game. That will teach you how the pieces move pretty quickly. So anyway, on with this episode. Let's start with the opening. To open the game of Shogi, the 2 most popular moves are to push this pawn forward or to push this pawn forward. And they're very logical moves. This is the rook, and when you push this pawn forward, you're hoping to open up a file for the rook and just give this piece more scope. And this is the bishop, and when you push this pawn forward, you're opening up a diagonal for your bishop. So very logical moves. But beyond the first couple of moves, you have a choice to make with your rook. And that really provides the main categorization of the shogi openings. The question is, do you want to leave the rook here or do you want to move it? And it's not in a bad spot here, so it's quite popular just to leave the rook there. Notice that the rook is pointing at your enemy's bishop, so you can push this pawn forward, threaten to open up this file, and attack on this side of the board. So when you leave the rook in one place and just push this pawn forward, then that's called a static rook opening. And then the other style of opening is where you actually change the position of the rook. I mean, it also makes some sense to move the rook over here to where the king is, or any of these files over on this side, as an option to leaving it over on the right side of the board. And when you do that, that's called a ranging rook opening. And the most popular squares for placing the ranging rook are here and here, the central location, or the 4th file rook. So why do you have to decide so early? The thing is, at the beginning of the game, this second row here is like a highway, and the rook can swing back and forth. But after a couple of moves, these pieces are going to come out. The silver may come up here, the gold here, and then all of a sudden the rook doesn't have as much scope, or maybe this silver comes up. And so this what starts out as a highway here becomes a clogged freeway full of pieces. So you kind of have to decide early on where to put that rook. In this video, I'm just going to focus on the static rook positions, but I will talk a little bit about the ranging rook, because you'll have to counter that. So let's go and talk about the Yagura opening. By the way, I got most of this information about the openings from the Hidechi videos, and I recommend those. I'll include a pointer to them in the description of this video. I also learned a few things from reading the shogi opening pages on Wikipedia, which seems to be a pretty good source as well. In Wikipedia, they called this the fortress opening rather than the Yagura, but I'm sticking with Yagura because that's what Hidechi called it. The Yagura opening starts with pushing this pawn forward to open up the diagonal for the bishop. And then the next stage is to maneuver the gold and the silver into position. The order you do this can vary depending on how white plays at this point. So if white starts the rook pawn going forward immediately, then you start the silver going, and you move diagonally because the gold is going to come to that square, and you want to leave that possibility open. If the rook pawn pushes forward once more, then you put the silver here. And so this is one idea of the Yagura opening, is you put the silver here to protect this square along with this pawn and slow down the attack. So notice this is aimed at a static rook position. So black is playing a static rook position and white is playing a static rook position, and that is where the Yagura opening is mostly played. In a different move order, let's back up, and I wanted to give you the alternative move order. After pushing here, if white opens up the bishop diagonal and offers the trade, then you move the gold first, and you put the gold next to the bishop, so the gold is protecting the bishop, and that allows your silver to maneuver to this square. So now if white starts pushing this pawn, then you can start the silver on the journey and get to that square where it's protecting here. And in the meantime, this gold is continuing to protect your bishop. So aside from that move order wrinkle, I'm not going to talk about move order here. I just want to get to the position of the Yagura opening. So these pawns come forward. This also blocks the bishop's diagonal and helps to prevent a trade. The idea is to avoid the bishop trade at the beginning and actually reposition the bishop. And then this gold comes forward. Another pawn comes forward, and the gold goes all the way up here. So you have the three generals up in this area, and now the king starts coming forward. I think the king moves over a little earlier normally. And the bishop repositions. So the bishop goes here and then here. So it switches to this diagonal, and the king moves here and then here to get into the castled position. So this is the Yagura castle, and you'll see that we have three generals around the king, and the king is moved away from the rook. So that's those are two kind of shogi opening principles. One is to castle your king away from where your rook is, because often there's a lot of fighting around the rook and things will open up, so you want to kind of get away from that. And the other principle is defend your king with three generals. Now, how do you attack from this position? Well, you have your static rook here, so you're going to be attacking on this file. You'll be pushing this pawn forward, and you'll be bringing the silver in. So the silver may come in like this, and then lastly bring the knight in. So this is a pretty good attacking force. The silver, the knight, the rook, and the bishop are all coordinating on this side of the board, and right now you're ready to push this pawn forward. Of course, I haven't given white any moves. White is going to play moves to stop that, maybe pushing this pawn forward to keep your silver from coming there. White can also put a silver up here to block a pawn from coming forward. But your idea is to just push forward on the side where your rook is, and your king is going to be safe over here. At least that's the principle. One more attacking idea is the knight can come from here to here to this square, actually this square or this square, where it hits the piece that is defending that square. So that can be an annoying move to your opponent if you get the knight forward like that. So just a couple of attacking ideas for you. So this looks like a nice setup, but as I said, it's mainly played when your opponent is also going for a static rook opening. And the problem with the Yagura is that the strength is over on this side of the board. So you've concentrated your defenses for the king on this side in anticipation of an attack by your opponent along the rook file. You've gathered the pieces over here to defend against that. But if your opponent plays a ranging rook opening, brings this over here to the central position or the fourth file position, and you're actually weak over on this side of the board. You don't have a lot of defenses. And if at some point he can drop a piece down here, he can attack from the side, and this can be a very dangerous attack. The rook can promote, and you have trouble defending. So that's why it's not a universal opening, but it is useful in playing against other static rook positions. Okay, next I wanted to look at one ranging rook type of opening. I'm going to show a setup that is often used by the ranging rook player against a static rook opening. So say that, well, let's start off with this move again, opening up a diagonal for the bishop. And then your opponent responds with a push. The idea in this ranging rook opening is to keep the bishop on and actually use it. So the bishop is coming to this square. So you push the pawn forward to block the diagonal. Now if your opponent starts pushing the rook pawn forward, and he's a static rook player as I said, you put the bishop here. So the pawn can come forward to here, but you're stopping it from coming forward any further. And now you can play the characteristic move of the ranging rook opening. You can bring the rook over. Notice that with the bishop out of the way, it actually opens up the possibility of the rook coming over to oppose the rook, that's an option. Can play here, here, or here. Central file rook has become popular recently, but let's go with this one, the fourth file rook. And then after this, I'm not going to give exact moves anymore, just to give a general idea. The king can run over here, and notice that it's very quick to get to the castled position, unlike the Yagura castle where it took a little bit of maneuvering with the pieces to open up a path for the king to get into the castle. Here the king goes directly into the castle with no problem. And then the silver comes up to defend the pawns there and maybe to go into the game later. This pawn pushes forward to provide an escape for the king. Over here, the silver comes forward. This protects the bishop in case this diagonal opens up. It helps to protect, yeah, it needs to protect the bishop. The rook is not protecting it, so it was sitting there undefended. And this gold comes here. And then often this pawn comes forward to provide a path for this bishop to get into the game. The attack is going to proceed along the rook file with the help of the silver, and perhaps some other pieces will manage to get into the game as well. But this is known as the Mino castle, and that's all I wanted to say about the ranging rook openings. You can find out more in Hidechi's video, but for the rest of this video I'm going to be looking at static rook openings. So returning to static rook openings, I mentioned in talking about the Yagura opening that it's not so great against a ranging rook player because it protects the front in front of the king. The king castles over here and the front is protected, but a ranging rook player will attack on the center and on the side and try and get in that way. So what kind of opening can you play against a ranging rook player? Well, first of all, you might not know the style of play of your opponent, so you might want to find out what style of play he has. So one way to do that is to start out by pushing a rook pawn forward. And if he plays like this and defends with the bishop, then that's a pretty good indication that he's a ranging rook player, and you might want to try something different than your Yagura opening. I mean, you can still go for the Yagura setup at this point, but maybe it's not the best. So another alternative here is the boat castle. So let's take a look at this. You can push this pawn forward, open up that diagonal, and now your opponent doesn't want to trade that bishop off because he wants to keep it to defend against that pawn push. So he goes here. And you can place some more pawn moves here. So I will go through. Let's give white the same number of moves too. So he brings his rook over. Say he goes for the Mino castle. You continue with the pawn pushes. I don't know if this is all exactly correct in terms of move order, but and you can start moving your king over, and then both players get their king to the castled position. Let's see, the next move in the Mino castle, well, one of the moves is to push this forward. I guess the next move is to bring the silver up here. These two stay the same. The gold comes here. This pawn comes up. And this is it. This is actually the boat castle here. So it's a very quick castle compared to the Yagura. You get to it pretty quickly. It's not as strong in front, but you don't have as much to worry about in front because your opponent has put his king over here and he's put his rook over on this side of the board. So the real action is going to be on this side of the board to the right and in the center. Although always keep an eye on this diagonal. And now from this position, let's say the silver comes up here usually, but there's actually, you can use either silver to attack. Even this silver can come out into the game. This is known as the left silver attack, something like that. You can bring it forward, use it to support this pawn push, and get a pretty strong and quick attack over on this side of the board. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to disrupt things by getting a quick attack going. And you've got these two golds that are near the king. Notice they're not in front of it, though. They're to the side. So there's more protection against attacks from the center and the side by leaving the two golds over here. And then these silvers can come forward and participate in the attack. Also, there's room for this knight to come forward as well. Notice this pawn structure here with the pawns on every other square. It leaves a lot of holes in it for the silver to slip through. The silver is a very maneuverable piece on this kind of structure because it can go both forwards and backwards on the diagonal. The gold, on the other hand, is not so often used as an attacking piece, and this is one of the reasons that the gold comes up here and then gets attacked from the front like that. The gold can't retreat. It's actually trapped there. It can't go diagonally backwards. It can only go straight back, and it's got its own piece on the way, whereas the silver can sneak out in that direction, and it's not a problem. It can just run back if that pawn comes forward. So I think that's all I wanted to say about the boat castle. I just wanted to give you another alternative to play when you're facing a ranging rook player, so you don't always have to try and go for the Yagura opening all the time. And remember, there's lots more Hidechi videos about the opening, so you can get more details about it. I want to show a couple of offbeat openings, and then I will go on to talk about the endgame. The next opening I wanted to talk about is the wing attack, and in particular the double wing attack. So the wing attack just involves pushing your rook pawn forward. The idea is to push it forward and open up a file for your rook, and also bringing the silver in to support the advance of that pawn can be very valuable. So this is sometimes called the pole climbing silver. This rook makes a pole here, and the silver climbs it, and then you push this pawn forward, and the silver here, if you can get to this situation, is a very strong piece backed up by the rook. Nobody can really oppose it. Even if your opponent tries to stop you by dropping a pawn here, you can just take it unless there's some other piece defending it. The bishop doesn't defend that square. And so it'd have to be a piece that's less valuable than the silver defending there, or lesser or equal value, I guess. So that's an interesting attack. And you can just try playing that way rather than worrying about castling and all that stuff. Although I guess as you get stronger, you do need to worry about, and your opponents get stronger, you do need to worry more about defense. But another thing that can happen is your opponent can go for the double wing attack. And this is a pretty famous line. You push the pawn, he pushes the pawn, you push, white pushes. And then at this point, you don't keep pushing, but you play a defensive move. You bring the gold over here, placing it next to the bishop. It defends the bishop, but it also defends this pawn in front of the bishop. And your opponent does the same. He plays here, and then you push the pawn. Your opponent takes. You take back. And then your opponent drops down a pawn here. And the rook has to retreat. It has really nowhere to go side to side, so it drops back. Can go all the way back to your own camp, or it can stop here and prevent this pawn from advancing, at least for the moment. You're going to have to push some of these pawns forward, so you will. The game will continue from here. So that's an interesting line and a way you can play. And then there's a little trick here that's useful to know about, and it illustrates some features of shogi. Suppose you don't play this defensive move with the gold. Suppose you push, your opponent pushes, you push, your opponent pushes, and you push. Just keep on pushing, not bothering to defend. Your opponent can take that pawn, so he'll have a pawn in hand. You take back. And now your opponent can push. This rook here is not really threatening anything. The bishop is protected by the silver and the gold. This pawn is protected by the gold and the bishop, and this pawn is protected by the knight and the bishop. Yeah, the knight also protects that pawn. So this rook is not really hitting anything and can be ignored. It doesn't have to be chased away right away. So white can afford to push the pawn forward. You take. And then now, instead of the automatic recapture, white can make use of this pawn in hand and drop it here. And in fact, you're in big trouble now. Your bishop, if you look at it, it's boxed in. It has no squares that it can go to. So in fact, you're losing a piece. The only thing you can do is attack the bishop. But because suddenly the tables have turned and white is attacking first, he actually comes out ahead in this variation. So that's a little trick to know about. And if you ever get into one of these double wing attack situations. The last opening I wanted to show you was this funny opening line called the wrong diagonal bishop. According to Wikipedia, this is one of the oldest shogi openings around, and I think it's not considered that great, but it was a funny line, and I actually saw it in a game and had it played against me. So it starts off like this. You open up the bishop's diagonal. Your opponent does the same, and you take the bishop, which maybe you're wondering, why don't they just take the bishop all the time? And well, you can promote when you take the bishop, but it doesn't matter because your opponent is going to take back. The bishop was protected there by the silver. So now it's your turn. You have a piece in hand, and you can drop it anywhere on the board, and there actually is a fork. So it's always something to look for when you have a bishop in hand. Is there a fork you can play? It's only against pawns, but it's a fork. It gains material. Okay, yeah, I was just pausing to give you time to look for it. I'm going to give the answer away now. You can slap the bishop down there, and it's hitting this pawn, and it's hitting this pawn. And now there's no way to defend both of those pawns. White has to defend, has to choose which pawn to defend, and I think just bringing the gold forward and defending this pawn is better. Notice if you defend this pawn, let's see, how do you even defend it? Oh, the silver coming forward would defend that pawn. Then the bishop can come in here and take this pawn, and it can also promote at the same time. So that's the more important pawn. It's near your king. You don't want to have a promoted bishop or a horse near your king. So you don't want to do that. What you want to do is defend this pawn and let your opponent take that pawn. And then, well, the game continues from here. White has a bishop that he can play. He can drop anywhere. But for the moment, black is a pawn up. And, well, the reason this is called the wrong diagonal bishop is because at the beginning of the game, the bishop was on this diagonal, the long diagonal that goes through the center of the board. Now it's on the neighboring diagonal. It doesn't go through the center of the board anymore. And it's, like I said, it's not considered so great anymore. If you look at black's position, he has one developed piece. He's a pawn up, so he gained material, but pawns are not that important in shogi. And if we look at white's position, white has developed two pieces. He's moved the silver forward and he's moved the gold forward. So this has given a development advantage to white. So I think that's why it's not considered so great anymore. But as I said, I had this played against me once, so I guess it's still playable at the amateur level. Okay, that's all I wanted to show in the openings, and next I wanted to talk about the endgames. In the game of chess, the amount of force on the board tends to decrease over time. I mean, there is the exception of promoting a pawn to a queen, which can increase the level of force at a particular point, but in general, the endgame in chess is study of positions with reduced material, whereas in shogi, the amount of force is increasing throughout the game. Any piece that's captured can be dropped back into the game, so the number of pieces stays about the same, and pieces get promoted, and if they're not captured, they stay promoted. So the level of force is increasing, and usually what happens is both sides are attacking, and then one side achieves a critical breakthrough and starts going for a mating attack. So the end game in shogi refers to checkmating the king. And I just want to show a couple of common checkmating patterns. So the first thing I wanted to mention is that that move is not a checkmate. Even with this, I have a simplified example, but I still gave my opponent a couple of pieces. And what he can do with the piece in hand is he can drop it here and defend against the checkmate. Now, he may lose pretty quickly anyway, but that is not a checkmate. And so you will see very often in shogi that the checkmates involve a piece that is placed right up next to the king. That way no piece can be dropped in between to shield the king from the check. So a gold here, defended by any other piece, is going to be a checkmate. For example, instead of a rook, I could have had a silver there. This is still a checkmate because the gold covers the 2 squares to the side, and it covers all 3 squares in front. If we were to reverse these roles, this is not a checkmate. The king has this square it can go to. The silver covers all 3 squares in front, so the king can't run out to directly to the side. It can't come here because the gold covers that square, but it can come here. That's a free square. Silver does not cover it, so this is not checkmate. So this is an important pattern to remember. Another idea in terms of checkmating patterns is the use of promotion. So say we have a rook here and a silver here. If I just bring the rook over in front of the king, that's a check, but it's not a checkmate. The king can run to either side. But I can move the rook, and since I'm in the enemy camp, I can promote when I move it. So I pick it up, I promote it, and I set it down. Now that piece is a dragon, and the dragon has all the moves of the rook, plus the moves of the king, which means it attacks every square in that box around it. So that is checkmate. And of course the bishop, the silver there is needed to defend the dragon. Otherwise the king could just take it. So those are the kind of common checkmating patterns when the king's escape is blocked from behind. And here it's blocked because of the board, but you know, it could be somewhere else, and its escape could be blocked because the squares behind it are covered by its own pieces, or by long-range pieces that have those squares covered. Another kind of position where the king has limited mobility is on the side of the board. Say the king is over here, and once again you want to use the gold to checkmate ideally, but you also need to prevent the king from escaping. So this situation here is a checkmate, but it would not be a checkmate without the pawn. So from this situation, the gold covers the 3 squares in front. It covers a square to the side. It's defended by the silver, and it attacks the square behind it. The gold attacks that square. The silver does not, but the gold attacks that square. But the king can run here. So you need one more piece to cover this square, often a pawn, to prevent the king from escaping. But of course, any piece will do. If you had a long-range piece like a bishop here, that would also be checkmate. But again, having a gold next to the king like that is a key to checkmating. And golds will be very plentiful in the endgame because when you move a pawn forward, it promotes to a gold. So this is a kind of a typical endgame position. Your own golds maybe will be back around your king defending, but you can get more golds by all the minor pieces promote to a gold. So this kind of situation would be a checkmate as well. And then once again, if this were a silver here instead of a gold, that's not even check. The king is not in check there. The silver attacks these 3 squares. The king has no moves here, I have to admit. So maybe it'll be checkmate on the next move. Let's think about this. If the pawn comes forward, that's check. The silver defends the pawn attacks the king can't run to these squares. This gold protects the silver, and this gold also protects this square, so the king can't escape. So that is a checkmate. Okay, I just wanted to show you those checkmating ideas. So I thought I'd finish this video off by showing you a couple of games I played not too long ago. These are both short losses, but these losses can be more instructive than the long wins. So I have white here. My opponent starts off pushing his rook pawn. And, you know, I think knowing what I do now, I probably should have started moving this silver forward. But in any case, I started pushing my rook pawn. And he defended with his gold the way you're supposed to. And then we got this exchange in, and then I retreated my rook here, and he started bringing his silver out. So he wasn't in any hurry to push his rook pawn. He brought his silver out. Now I brought my silver up. So I'm starting to get the idea, but I think maybe he could have pushed the pawn a little earlier. And we get into this situation where I brought my gold in to defend the bishop, and I have my silver here. I think I'm doing okay. I got one exchange in here, and I got my rook out, so I think I'm all right. He pushes the pawn. I take it. He takes back, and I take his silver. He takes, and then I drop a pawn. So his rook has to retreat. Notice that my rook is defending this pawn, which would otherwise be loose. So that's an important point there. So his rook drops back, and then I just started moving a gold up here, and he dropped his silver back immediately. Now notice I have a silver in hand too, so I could drop my silver to this square. Oh, it doesn't let me. Maybe I can draw an arrow that way to this square. I could drop my silver there, and we would get back to the same situation. He could drop a pawn, I could take it, he could take, I could take. I could take with the rook, and then I drop a pawn once again, and then the rook has to retreat. So I would gain a move each time we went through that cycle, so it seems like that would be okay for me. So that's what I should play here. I should put my silver there. Instead, I thought he couldn't do very much there, and I wanted to kick his bishop back, so I moved this pawn forward. Notice the pawn is supported by the lance, so it's defended, and it is attacking his silver. But he didn't respond immediately to that. Instead, he dropped a pawn here. And now if I take his silver, he takes my pawn, but it attacks my bishop, and I wasn't really sure how that would end up. So instead, I took the pawn, thinking also that was safe. Probably it's safest to take his silver. Anyway, I took his pawn. He takes with the silver, and now I realize I'm in a little bit of trouble because he's got the silver on an open file with the rook behind it. This is actually very strong. He can place the silver. He can bring the silver one move forward because the gold is defending that square, but the bishop is not. So he can step in here and harass my bishop. Let's see. I tried dropping a pawn there, but that doesn't do anything. He just takes the pawn and promotes the bishop. And then I resigned here. So a very short game. If we back up, at this point, instead of dropping the pawn, probably I should run away with the bishop. Or let's see. Oh, I still have a silver. I could drop a silver here to this square, and then that would defend in front of my bishop. So maybe that's the move to play. But anyway, a quick game and an example of what can go wrong. Also, you have to be aware when your opponent has two pieces in hand like this, a silver and a pawn, he can get into position very quickly, right? It took him a lot of moves to bring the silver up here and to bring the pawn up here, but now that they're in hand, he can drop them back down onto those squares very quickly. So when he dropped the silver, I should probably respond by dropping my silver right away. I mean, maybe that's a rule of thumb too you could think of. If you have a piece in hand and your opponent has just dropped a piece, maybe you need to consider dropping a piece to maintain the level of force on the board, even if you don't see an immediate great thing. I mean, it's tempting to keep pieces in hand over here looking for some fork or something that might show up later, but at the same time, while you're doing that, you have less force on the board. Okay, there was one more game I wanted to look at. This is a game that illustrates what can go wrong when you don't worry about your king safety enough. So once again, I have the white pieces, and my opponent plays a central rook strategy. He's going to bring his rook over in front of the king. I'm sticking with the static rook, and but I started by opening up this diagonal for the bishop. So let's go forward a few moves. Now I start pushing my rook pawn forward and try and open up a line here. He does the typical pawn drop, and my rook retreats, but I'm going to bring my silver over. I took one move to bring the gold up to defend the bishop, and then I'm going to bring this silver forward and try and get an attack going on this side of the board. Notice that this pawn push here, when he pushed that pawn, it makes it difficult for me to get my silver. It covers a square in front of it, so it makes me difficult for me to get my silver over here to support, say, a pawn drop here. So that's an interesting defensive move there. He's also just advancing his pawns in the center and opening things up in front of my king. And so this is very dangerous. Let's see. He advanced the pawn forward. I took, and he takes with the rook. And now I'm in check. I bring my rook over to defend. He trades. I take back. And then he drops his rook right here. And so this is one of the things you have to watch out for in shogi. Once your opponent has a piece in hand, there are often squares within your own camp where he can drop a piece. And this square is completely undefended. Now that my rook is gone, there's no natural defender of the second rank. The bishop can't defend the square directly behind it. These two squares to either side are defended by the bishop, but not that square right there. So this is looking pretty risky. I decide to drop a rook here to defend, and he takes my silver. Yeah, I couldn't see a way to defend everything. I don't know if I found the best defense there, but anyway, I just wanted to show he starts mopping up. And notice that when he moves his piece within my camp, he promotes it to a dragon. So now he's got a dragon in my camp here, and I start trying to bring some pieces around. And here he, after taking my silver, his next move is to immediately drop the silver here and attack my rook. And so I'm in big trouble here. I get the rook out of the glare of the silver. I don't want to trade it for a silver. And then he drops his rook down to give me a check along the diagonal. And this is a very difficult situation for me. Notice that I can't move the gold to this square because the gold does not move backwards diagonally. So that's not a legal move. I probably need to drop my rook back, and then he can just take it because he has that square covered with his silver. But instead what I did was I dropped a pawn, and I lost immediately. So that's the end of the game because I violated the two-pawn rule. There's a pawn there and there's a pawn there. I have two pawns on the same file. So, you know, it's easy to get carried away. I was looking for a defensive move. I said, aha, I have a couple of pawns here that can block the check, and I dropped one here without checking if there was already a pawn in that file. So anyway, a couple of short games for your amusement. Notice that this is the 81 Dojo website. Notice that they are using the single character pieces. So each piece has just a single character. It's the top character of the two-piece names that you saw on the boards that I was using. Anyway, in the description of this video, I'll have some hints for places you can go to learn more about the game. I'll probably do some more videos about shogi, maybe some live games with commentary, or maybe just some videos when I learn something new that I think are of interest. But that's it for this little 5-game series of Learn to Play Go. Learn to Play Shogi. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you later. Bye.